As we look at Paul McCartney's music through the decades, let's just take a moment and see how many albums he's done in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the first part of the 90s. Now we're going to move to the second part of the 90s. And, Paul just never stops. And it's just incredible the different things that he gets into. So let's take a look at what he does between 1996 and 1999. Are you ready then? Let's drop the needle. As we saw at the end of the last episode, Paul, George, and Ringo got involved in a massive project called the Beatles Anthology, which really was to be kind of the defining history of the Beatles in their own words. It was to be a book, it was to be a massive TV project, and of course it spawned a number of albums. And the great thing about all these anthology albums is that they included something the Beatles had never done before, which was outtakes, studio chatter. You could see how songs developed. It was really quite enlightening. Now, Anthology 1 had a demo of John Lennon's called Free as a Bird, which the other three fleshed out and made a song. So now they release Anthology 2, which has another John Lennon demo, which is called Real Love, which again, with Jeff Lynne as the producer, they flesh out again to be a real song. And then later in October of 1996, they released the third and final anthology album, which was also supposed to have a John Lennon demo on it, which is called Now and Then. But it was deemed not acceptable. They couldn't clean it up enough to get it done. Now, it always stuck in Paul McCartney's head that there was this unfinished Beatles song. And as we'll find out quite a few years later, he actually gets his wish comes true when it becomes, quote-unquote, the final Beatles song. Now, Paul has said that working on the anthology project really energized him because he remembered how the Beatles could make music and how dynamic and fun it was. So he decides on this new album he'll use Jeff Lynne as his producer, but also with George Martin. In addition to Linda and Ringo, he gets Steve Miller and then also his son James to work with him on this record. And the record is called Flaming Pie. Now there's a reason it's called Flaming Pie. Back in the early days of Beatlemania, some interviewer asked John Lennon, "Where did you get your name?" And he said this man came out of the sky flying on a flaming pie and said, "From this day forward, you shall be known as Beatles with an A." So that's what Paul McCartney decided he would call this album, Flaming Pie. I like the tracks, the song we were singing, The World Tonight. There is the great Calico Skies. Then there's the title song, Flaming Pie. Used to Be Bad, featuring Steve Miller, who wrote it with Paul. Then there's Little Willow, Paul's song written to Ringo and his first wife's Maureen's kids to help them during their grief about Maureen's recent death. Really Love You, co-written with Ringo. And the album closes with Great Day. It's a great album and was well received by the critics. It reached number 2 in the UK and the US. Now Paul decides to go back to classical music again. And this is based on a long poem Paul wrote, which was about a Celtic man trying to figure out his role in the universe, his purpose in life, and the album is called Standing Stone. Like the earlier classical piece, Liverpool, Ontario, Standing Stone reaches number 1 on the classical charts and 184 on the US pop albums listing. But during this period, Paul is really adventurous. Not only has he done, the Beatles anthology stuff, created some new music in Flaming Pie, done another classical album, now he decides to go back and work again with Youth on a new Fireman album. And this one is called Rushes. Now, do you get the joke? The fireman rushes in, the line from Penny Lane. There are 8 songs on this album. As far as I know, the album is no longer in print, but you can find it on Apple Music and probably other streaming services as well. Then in April of 1998, Linda McCartney dies after a long battle with cancer. And Paul takes a year to work through his grief as he goes into mourning. But when he comes out of that period, he decides he wants to record something, and he wants to do it very quickly. So he calls his friend David Gilmour from Pink Floyd and decide they'll make a new album, which is called Run Devil Run. And it's basically an album covering old rock and roll songs, but with 3 new ones by Paul McCartney. I like She Said Yeah, All Shook Up, the McCartney-written Run Devil Run, and Try Not to Cry that he also wrote, Brown Eyed Handsome Man, and What It Is, the 3rd McCartney song. And then the album closes with Shake a Hand and Party. It hits number 12 in the UK and 27 in the US. And then, just after a month after releasing Run Devil Run, Paul makes another classical album called Working Classical. And the idea here is he's going to take McCartney songs and elevate them into classical music. Besides familiar songs, it also includes A Leaf, Haymakers, Midwife, Spiral, Warm and Beautiful, Some Days, Tuesday, and then of course it closes with The Lovely Linda. Obviously, Paul is still mourning. Like his previous classical albums, this album was a success on the classical charts. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. Here are the albums that he has released in the 90s. Quite an accomplishment, from reworking the Beatles' history to solo work to classical work to covering old rock and roll songs. This guy just doesn't stop. And now we're going to move into a new millennia. We're going to move into the decade of 2000. That's the next episode. Thanks for watching, and keep a rockin'.
If you like this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.